that we always, I think that one of the things we always find sort of to our surprise in the sector is just how damaging some of the approaches from some of the NHS staff who aren't used to dealing with this kind of thing can really be, and the impact that it has on other people who present for many, many different reasons. For what it's worth, and I don't think this is at all helpful now, there's absolutely no reason they couldn't have given you pills the first time round. There's absolutely no reason that you had to wait for 2 weeks. There's absolutely no reason they couldn't have given you surgery. But unfortunately, the way that it is seen within quite a lot of the medical establishment is that, you know, they want to be sure, they want to spend their time sort of, I suppose, gatekeeping is maybe the best way of describing it. And I think that happens a lot within the NHS. And I think that actually kind of brings me quite well to sort of where I'm coming from and where I work. So I work for the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. We're the largest abortion provider in the UK, and we're basically like the UK's version of Planned Parenthood. And the reason that we exist is because back in 1967, when the Abortion Act was passed, we were established in Birmingham, and the lead gynecologist in Birmingham said, I don't care what the law says about abortion, we will not be providing abortions in my hospitals. So women's choices at that point were essentially entirely constrained. They weren't able to access them on the NHS. Their only option was to carry on going down to Harley Street and paying private prices, which obviously put them out of risk of the vast majority of women. So we started up a clinic as a charity and grew from there. And for about 30 years, we provided at charitable rates to women abortion services. And sort of from the 90s onwards, we started being commissioned by the NHS. So about 99% of the procedures that we provide now are funded by the NHS. They are commissioned by clinical commissioning groups or now integrated care boards. And essentially you access us like you access any other care, though we do have self-referral. So essentially if you Google, I need an abortion in your area, you'll come directly through to one of us, and we take your care on from beginning to end. It means you don't need referral from a GP, you don't need to go to a sexual health clinic. A lot of the time that we have spent over many, many years has been about making abortion as easy to access as possible and as sort of painless at an organisational level as possible, because the Abortion Act, as it's actually written, doesn't provide for the kind of abortions really that we provide and have been providing for many, many years. And that kind of comes back to what BPAS's main goal is as an organisation, which hasn't just been about providing that care, but advocating for the women that we see. And a significant part of that is about interpreting quite a restrictive law, quite frankly, in the most liberal way possible, and making sure that when a woman comes to us, the care that she is provided with is person-centred, that it's focused on her needs, and that it doesn't essentially end with us turning her away because we don't agree with the reasons why she might be having an abortion. And the reason that could happen is because the Abortion Act, as it was passed, brought in by David Steele, obviously, in 1967, and the way that it's framed is that it doesn't decriminalise abortion. So abortion is still a criminal offence in England and Wales. It's a criminal offence under the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 and also the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929. Both of those carry a life sentence for anybody who attempts to end a pregnancy outside the provisions of the Abortion Act. What the Abortion Act does is make abortion legal in certain circumstances. So you need to have 2 doctors' signatures. You need to meet one of 5 grounds in order to have an abortion, and it needs to take place in a licensed premises or an NHS hospital. If you as a woman who's pregnant don't want a child, that's not a legal reason to have an abortion. If you buy pills online, you're committing a crime that carries a life sentence. If you as a doctor decide to provide an abortion with just your say-so, you're committing a crime that carries a life sentence. So there is still quite a lot of criminal law background to the services that are provided. And what that's meant is that for many, many years, providers like BPAS have had to stand up for what we believe should be the way abortions are provided, which is responsive to women, accessible, And we deal with all that stuff in the background. So if you turn up, you call us, you get an appointment, you speak to a nurse or midwife for about 45 minutes. They then send all your information off, and you have 2 doctors that do the signatures completely behind the scenes. Women don't have to go to different doctors. They don't have to sit down in front of them and justify themselves. They don't need to get a referral from their GP. We do those signatures in the background. And since for the past 2 years, we've then been able to post medication in the mail and get that to women who can take it in their own homes. But I think it has been I think we shouldn't underestimate the journey that has had to happen over the last 55 years to get to this point. And it is something that has required constant vigilance and also advocacy work to ensure that we weren't just satisfied with where we were. Is it useful for me to take questions now, or should I wait until the end?
I think let's wait till the end. Kathy, if you just want to put your hand down, and there'll be ample opportunity, and we will use the raised hand system, I think, after Rachel is done. Thanks, Kathy. All right, please continue.
That's right. I will carry on talking as fast as I can. So that's kind of where we've been pushing. The most recent, I think, good example of this is about 3 months ago, we beat the government in Parliament. So during the course of the pandemic, after a not insignificant amount of work in the first couple of weeks, we have been able to provide pills by post. And that's our service where women call, they have a telemedical consultation. So that's either over the telephone or over video. And then as long as they're clinically eligible, they know when their last period was, they're sure of it, they don't have any medical contraindications, they can receive that medication through the post. Sajid Javid decided to take this away. So it was time limited, like all the other COVID provisions. And we kept telling him that this was ridiculous for women, it was impossible for the service. He still decided, come about February, that he was going to remove it. So we put in an amendment in the House of Lords, and I do have to say, with an amazing baroness who is called Liz Sugg and is a Tory. Sorry, terrible. She worked in number 10 under Cameron, so she's a different kind of Tory. She's a coalition Tory. She's good friends with, actually, so I've sat with her in the Lords a few times. She's good friends with Chris Fox and Jeremy Purvis, so I think it's all right. We can adopt her as one of our own. She put in an amendment that said essentially that amended the Abortion Act to make this a legal provision. So before that, it was something that the Secretary of State had power over. He could decide one day he was going to allow it and decide another day not to. We decided that the best thing to do to take that power away from him was to put it in legislation. So that went through the Lords at about 1 AM during the Health and Care Bill. And then it went to the Commons. And in all honesty, I was absolutely convinced we were going to lose. He turned up and marched all of his health ministers through the lobby. They were shadow whipping. And they lost. They lost by quite a sizable amount. And I mean, that was wonderful. I sat there and I was like, I must have misunderstood which way they were voting, because we obviously lost. But then no, we didn't. We'd actually won. So that was delightful. And it went back through the Lords at the other end. Meanwhile, Sajid Javid was still mithering behind the scenes, sending texts, trying to convince people to change their mind on things. It's actually very, not particularly eye-opening, because you know that it happens already, but just genuinely shocking at the way in which he seemed to be freelancing compared to the position of his government and the position of the whips. And he just seemed to feel so personally, ego-wise aggrieved that he decided that what he was going to try and do was overturn it at any cost. But he lost time and time again, so that was good. So yes, so in law now, amended positively for the first time in 55 years, is the Abortion Act, which has now got telemedicine in there. So that's the kind of thing really, that's the kind of thing really that we focus on. It's trying to look at what we've got, but not be satisfied with it. I think that the way that we practice and provide enables us to make abortion as accessible as possible, but also we're not happy with where we are. And ultimately our biggest goal is decriminalisation of abortion. So that's removing the underlying criminalisation from the 1861 Act and the 1929 Act, which would mean that abortion would be treated like any other healthcare. Shock horror. There wouldn't be grounds, there wouldn't necessarily be time limits, it would be entirely within the hands of a woman and her medical team in terms of what was the right thing for her. And ultimately, that's what we think is the most important thing. It's also become particularly more important because you may have seen in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago that there are 2 women currently being prosecuted in England today for trying to end their own pregnancies. And those are either by getting pills on the internet or by misleading providers so that they can get the pills themselves. Those women were both in their 3rd trimester, but ultimately, and having spoken to one of them at great length, I think we can't underestimate the desperation that puts someone in a position where they are willing to take pills and they don't necessarily know what it will do to their health. They don't necessarily know how they'll deal with it at home by themselves. And then to be taken to hospital and disclose something to your medical team and have that medical team turn around and report you to the police for attempted child destruction, and you to now be on trial facing a life sentence, I think is something that we just can't sit by and watch. So that's my current focus, trying to get rid of that criminal law around women and make sure that never again can we threaten women with jail for ending their own pregnancies. So I think that's kind of where we are. And I know I spoke to Donna earlier about some of the work we're doing on protests around clinics and trying to get those banned. That's basically just an issue of parliamentary time. I don't think I even need to sell it to you. Everyone agrees that these people are completely mad. It's not even something that the vast majority of anti-abortion people support, because it's just completely insane. They'll stand outside, I had a report through today that a protester walked up to somebody, rubbed her stomach and said, "It's murder, you know," and then let her go in. It's just disgusting. There's no other way to put it. So yes, we're trying to get those banned. That would be 150 meters around a clinic that stopped you from doing things like that, stop you from holding up signs, stop you from using megaphones, stop you from aggressively praying and singing right outside the clinic, handing out rosary beads, calling people mum, following them down the road, pushing leaflets through their car windows, leaving baby socks in bushes, all things that I get reports of on a daily basis. So that's the other thing that we're doing. But I think that's probably covered everything.
Fair. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you for that window into the work that you're doing. And VPAS are doing as well. I will open the floor to questions. We will use the raised hand system and I'll just call a name and ask you to unmute. Kathy was first, so Kathy.
Oh gosh, I'm a bit nervous now. I would like to put a different point of view. I would say, I don't know exactly what Lib Dem policy is, but I would say I was moderately anti-abortion, not fanatically, not like the Americans, but usually there's a better way. Not in the case of where the child has already died in the womb or is seriously disabled. But, well, let me give a couple of stories of my experience.
Is there going to be a question though?
Um,
I'm happy for this to go into the discussion a bit later. I wanted this to be a Q&A in particular. Obviously you're happy to voice your opinion, but that's just like a later section, if that makes sense.
A question? You just want a question?
It's just a Q&A session right now, that's all.
Okay, so what exactly is Lib Dem policy on abortion?
So Lib Dem policy on abortion is to support decriminalisation. So that would remove it from the criminal law and make it just a medical procedure. It's also to support buffer zones around clinics, so to stop that kind of harassment that I was just talking about. There isn't a policy specifically on which way MPs should vote. But I think that there is a general acceptance, certainly so it was debated in Brighton in 2018, 2019. And I think the general consensus was, as liberals, we are all entitled to our own ethical positions on abortion and what we would do with our lives and what we would do with our bodies and even what we might think about what other people do with theirs. but ultimately that the place where that decision truly belongs is with the woman herself and not with government as a whole, and therefore criminalisation is wrong. So I think that's where, if that answers your question on what Lib Dem policy is. It was in the last manifesto as well. I made sure of that.
I'm assuming Kathy's okay with that. Thank you for asking that, Kathy. Sue, you've got your hand up.
I have. Sorry. Yeah, I've just been concerned about this new thing that's come up with this. There was this conference on religion and belief or something, and the original draft protected women's reproductive rights, and when it reappeared and people are signing up to it now, that has gone. There is no protection for women's bodily autonomy, and apparently this was to appease countries such as Malta who do not allow abortion. And do we know if, I mean, I saw Caroline Noakes was actually challenging the lovely Liz Truss about this today, but I don't know what the Dems are doing or where our position is or what we can do as an organisation, because this isn't right. We shouldn't be signing up to something that takes away women's bodily autonomy or doesn't agree that we have bodily autonomy. So that was my question. And the other question is, are we very dependent on the personal views of the health secretary when any of these things come up? Like, if they don't agree with abortion, then they'll do their best to sabotage anything that would help make it less criminal. So that was my two little questions from me.
Yeah, sure. So I think on the first one, I'm really sorry. I'm not sure what the Lib Dems have issued on that particularly. But in terms of what seems to have happened is that the joint country statement on freedom of religion and belief was drafted originally with quite a few other countries, including I think Denmark and Sweden, to specifically include that. Actually very topical in relation to what Kathy was talking about, that no matter what your own freedom of belief says, it can't be used to infringe on women's rights to make decisions about their own bodily autonomy. So essentially it was a way to try and square that circle of people who don't necessarily believe in abortion themselves, but who shouldn't be using it to block other people's access to abortion. You're absolutely right. That was then revised to specifically remove anything in relation not just to abortion, but to sexual and reproductive health and rights more broadly, which includes things like sex education. I think there are probably two people that might have been involved in that. One of which is probably Liz Truss herself, on the grounds that she needs. It's not that she is anti-abortion, but the group of people she is relying on to get her elected as the more conservative side of the Conservative Party. So she's been a lot more quiet on abortion rights in recent years because that's where her hinterland is. The second one is Fiona Bruce. Fiona Bruce, the MP for Congleton, is an arch anti-abortion person. She's also our person, our like international ambassador for freedom of religion and belief. And by freedom of religion and belief, she means the right of people to stand outside clinics harassing women. So I guess it was probably something to do with one of those. I know that the Humanists, so we signed up to a letter or petition that the Humanists had done around that. And I know there's some other work going on, and that the international SRH group, which has got about 40 big organisations headquartered in the UK but deliver abroad, that they're doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes to try and reverse that. So I think they are not keen at the moment on publicly hitting the government, but they are quite keen to try and change what that says. So I'm kind of letting them do their thing there. I'm really sorry, I've forgotten the second question.
It was whether we're too dependent on the views of each individual health secretary to them blocking possible amendments. It sounds like Sajid wasn't keen on women having better access to abortion.
No, I think this is part of the issue of the Abortion Act. The Abortion Act provides the Secretary of State with the ability to make choices about where abortions can be performed. And this is why it was so relevant for the telemedical abortion. The reason it did that back in the 1960s is because the mischief they were trying to manage was backstreet abortions, people having abortions on kitchen tables, infection, women being harmed by illicit providers. So their solution to that was your abortion has to be in an NHS hospital, or it has to be somewhere that the Secretary of State has assessed, licensed, specific. So there are special places, and those were mainly clinics that women had to go to. Obviously, that's now all changed, because back in the 1960s, a woman spent about a week in hospital to have an abortion. Procedures were very, very different. They were quite a lot more invasive. Now, about 85% of abortions are early medical abortions. So that involves taking 2 sets of pills. It's about 98 to 99% effective in the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. The vast majority of women manage what is essentially a miscarriage at home themselves. So we're just in a very different clinical space than we were in the 1960s. But the problem is that the Abortion Act still grants to the Health Secretary, or at least did until about 3 months ago, the ability to decide what's licensed. So when Matt Hancock in 2020, well, actually, this is Matt Hancock at the beginning of when on the day lockdown was announced in the morning, he said, yes, women can take the pills at home, don't have to come into a clinic, which was what we were pushing for, because we'd had about 25% of our appointments cancelled, clinics were closing, women were terrified, nurses were struck down with COVID. He announced it, then they announced lockdown, and then that evening it disappeared from the website. And for the next week, we were battling behind the scenes to try and get it brought back. So it eventually got brought back when he was on his sick bed. I'm still fairly sure that number 10 just went, this is happening, and he just had to lump it. But it does give a really good idea. Oh, and before him, it was Matt Hancock, who doesn't support abortion either, wants to reduce the time limit to 12 weeks. And he just didn't allow any kind of home use of abortion. He blocked it physically for about 3 years. So yes, is the answer. Yes, we are reliant still on the Health Secretary. And this is a really good reason why decriminalisation is necessary, because it should be put back in the hands of women and doctors, and not in the hands of usually a terrible man who's bringing his own thoughts on it to what is medical healthcare.
Thanks, that was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Lizzie, you've got your hand up, go for it.
Hi. Rachel, how unequal is the provision? Because you're saying that I didn't have to go through that, but they said to me that there was no provision in the Abortion Act for me to walk in and terminate there and then. There wasn't, so they couldn't do it, and I had to wait a week. I know I used to work in Liverpool, where girls have very big families, and one of them said to me, it's not possible to get a termination, because if you start with your GP will say no. And that's it, you're stuck. And she said, she had 5 children, and she said, I don't want 5 children, but we don't have the option. Now, this is a while ago, but she said, we don't have this option. And I wonder, do you know how sort of equal the provision is across Britain? And if are there any other pockets?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question there. I can fully imagine that happening if we're talking maybe 20 years ago, something like that. And I think the main reason for that is something that we have done the best we can to address, and that's self-referral. So the issue previously being that if you go to a GP and your GP is anti-abortion, that your ability to get the referral that you needed into our service that was required not by us but by commissioners was basically impossible. And the reason that we have pushed very, very hard over a number of years to get self-referral in is so that women don't have to go through that. They Google us, they find a number, they find us on the back of a toilet door, they find us, their GP might give them the details, their friend might give them the details, they call one central number and they get into our system, and we give them an appointment. We've got clinics on the ground, we've also got telemedical services that deliver tens of thousands of these consultations. So in terms of access around the country, I think we have done away with that GP sort of blocking. I think it can be difficult for some women, as with any kind of healthcare, women who are from more deprived backgrounds, or people who live in rural areas, I think genuinely do probably have more issues in accessing care at later gestations. Now, what we do know is that telemedicine really helped those people. So if they are in rural areas, their waiting time to procedure and their gestation at treatment fell disproportionately compared to people in urban areas. And the same is true of women from more deprived areas. So their waiting time to treatment declined. And that's because those women are the people that need childcare, they need to book time off work, they need to wait for a day when, you know, if they're on a 0 hours contract, when they're not going to have to, because they're not going to get sick pay, they're not going to. So that accessibility early on in pregnancy has had a really big impact. But I think it is still problematic at later gestations, where women, it's not uncommon for women to have to travel significant distances. So we have 3 clinics in the country that go up to 24 weeks, one in Merseyside, one in Doncaster and one in Richmond. MSI, another national charity, has one, and that is in West London, and Bristol is their sort of slightly second one. There's one in Manchester, but that's really it in terms of clinics. And that's mainly because it is quite a specialised procedure. As the gestation goes on, risks do increase. Abortion is always safer than continuing a pregnancy to term and giving birth, but risks are higher at 23 weeks than they are at 6 weeks. And as a result of that, it is safer for women to have a centralised, specialised service where the people that are providing that care do so on a daily basis, so that you're not waiting for somebody who, you know, might have only done one 23-week abortion in the last few months. Instead, you're going to somebody who does these every week. So yes, I think there are issues with travelling. One of the things we do quite often, actually, out of our charitable remit, is pay for women to travel, pay for women to stay overnight. We try and get that money from commissioners, but in all honesty, in the vast number of places, it's just not forthcoming. So that's something that BPAS, just as a charity, covers, which I think, quite frankly, is disgusting, but there we go. You might have seen recently that in Scotland, we've been pushing on this particularly, that there is nowhere in Scotland that goes up to the legal limit. They mostly only go to 20 weeks. Women are generally sent down to London, and for a long time, it has been very difficult for them to know that they can get that money back, or that they can get it paid up front, because it's not just about getting the money back. For a lot of people, being able to pay for a train ticket or a plane ticket to stay overnight in London is just not, it just puts it out of reach completely. So yes, I think there are still problems, but I think at earlier gestations, we've done quite a lot to try and solve that. Yeah, once again, I've forgotten your first question. I just talked for too long, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. Sorry, yeah, can you repeat the other question?
No, I can't remember what it was either. It was just about equal. Oh no, it was about your experience and about what the restrictions are in the Act. So the reason I say you didn't have to wait is not because of the Abortion Act at all. It's because if they don't detect a heartbeat, if you knew you were at 12 weeks, you told them when you were testing positive, that is what's known as a miscarriage. It's a fairly common pregnancy complication in the early gestations in the first trimester, and it should have been treated like that. It shouldn't have been treated as if you were potentially looking for a termination, because you knew that you thought you were at 12 weeks, and that's when the booking should have said. And rather than saying, oh, well, that's definitely what's happened, they chose to consider that maybe maybe your pregnancy was still continuing and you were just wrong. And I think that lack of, it's a fact of not trusting what women are telling them that I think is a real issue. Because of that, nice guidance would suggest that the main way of managing it is expectant management. So what that is the second thing they did, which is say to you, you will probably pass this pregnancy by yourself and send you home. But in all honesty, if you had presented 5 weeks after the pregnancy ended and you still hadn't passed the pregnancy, I would expect them to have given you either mifepristone and misoprostol, which are the same drugs that you get for a medical termination, but it's not registered as a termination, or surgical treatment. So I suppose my issue is more their belief that somehow you needed to wait, because I think that that's frankly just cruel, and it misunderstands what the law says. They're right that if there was still a heartbeat, it would class as a termination.
but if there wasn't, then it doesn't. There are no time restrictions and waiting periods in the Act at all, so there's no reason for it being a week. That was more a medical management thing that they did there. So yeah, I'm really sorry that you had that experience, because I think the way that women are treated when they've had miscarriages, particularly women who don't necessarily want to wait until and see what happens, is really bad. Because, you know, we do some miscarriage management, and quite frankly, I think a lot of women are happier to have it over and not hanking over them waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for waiting, Helen. You've got your hand up. Go ahead and ask.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of parallels that I can use with other campaigns, but I was interested in I hadn't picked up about the 2 women being prosecuted. Do you think that there's a danger that anti-abortionists will try to increasingly enforce the law as they see it written? Therefore, I mean, I think we've already seen protests outside clinics increase, and I think you referenced that. But do you think that there's a danger that other routes to try and close down routes to abortion are going to increase as well?
So I don't want to sound complacent, because most of my job is about not being complacent, but I think that and I try and tell this to journalists, and I think they're just not very interested by it, so they don't report it. My position is very much that we are not in the same position as America. I think the idea that we would go from where we currently are to a situation where abortion is banned is essentially just, it's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is manyfold, but primarily more than 80% of MPs class themselves as pro-choice. More than 90% of the country class themselves as pro-choice. About 75% of the country want to see more liberal laws than there are at the moment. We have more than 200,000 abortions a year. We're not in a situation where people are trying to ban access. And I think one of the things that America really did very well with, essentially, is the banning that public funding, making women pay for themselves, making it sort of unconscionable for public money to be spent on it. And I just don't see us being in that situation, because, I mean, it sounds terrible, but at a really basic level, what Tory is going to sit there and say, you know what we want? Loads of women that can't afford babies having more babies. Like, they're just not going to, even for their own reasons, even though they're not our reasons for being pro-choice, for their own reasons, they have no desire to stop it. That being said, the anti-abortion groups will continue. They always have continued. They have been pushing the same lines since the 1960s. The lines about women coming over from other countries and using the NHS to abort their pregnancies, women who, you know, are having abortions just for frivolous reasons because they want to go on a skiing holiday, women who just don't really know what they're doing and they're being lied to by providers. These are lines that have been being used since the 1960s. And I suppose the reason that I am a little complacent is because they've never been successful. It's been 55 years and they have never, ever succeeded in reducing anything in the Abortion Act, never been successful in rolling back rights that have been granted. And I think that it is absolutely down to people like us who spend all of our time, you know, focusing on maintaining those rights, and to MPs and peers that spend their time defending them. But I think that they are not going to be successful. And the reason they're not going to be successful is for precisely that reason. There are always people that are going to oppose them. And quite frankly, they're quite see-through. I think that no matter how long they talk about harm done to women and, you know, the importance of families and, you know, women making these decisions frivolously and not thinking it through, people see through what they're saying to what they really mean. And what they mean is it is a belief that they are entitled to have, which is that life begins at conception, and that a life at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks in the womb is just as valuable as that of the adult person that it's living in. And that's just not where the vast majority of this country are. They just don't. And in all honesty, when I'm on the news with people like this, I just sit there and wait for them to dig themselves a hole, because they'll start off by talking about the nice things and the things that they think will win them over, and then it will go, but they're murdering babies in there. And at that point, you can see the newsreader turns off, everyone turns off, because it's just not where people are emotionally or academically. So that's kind of what I feel. I think that my position is we can't be complacent. We've got to carry on fighting, but we've been successful for the last 55 years. There's no reason to expect we won't carry on being.
Cool, thank you very much. I had a question then to follow on from that, which is, I agree that there isn't the appetite in this country for various reasons. I'm like, compared to the US, there isn't the appetite in this country to ban abortion, but pushing forward to decriminalize it and, to get this done better, like you mentioned how in Scotland, a lot of the time they're sent down south, and it's just sometimes the resources just aren't there, but basically to improve things. And it feels like hitting a hornet's nest. It feels like, apart from Javid, who wanted to take away the at-home medication, no one's really touching it. And it's an act from 1967 that really needs updating. No one wants to touch it. So where do we go from here? What do you think are the best steps to get it decriminalized? And I feel like now, what with the United States, obviously, having done that, it feels like now's an opportunity to sort of say, well, we'll do the opposite.
Yeah, so I think, so I've got two things that I'm currently working on. Two bits of legislation that I have written that I'm hoping if we get time. The main issue at the moment actually is not support in Parliament, it is time in Parliament, and the government being willing to give us the time that we need to debate and to vote on these issues. And that has been the case since I started in 2017. So firstly, I will say, buffer zones. We've got an amendment into the public order bill. I don't know what's going to happen to that when Priti Patel inevitably gets turfed out. I don't know whether that's going to continue. I don't, at a policy level, I really hope it doesn't continue, but it is where we have been thinking of pushing this. However, I did see yesterday that Liz Truss has promised to introduce a standalone street harassment law. And I think that would be a really good place to place this as well, because ultimately this is what it is. It's gendered street harassment. It's not protest. It's not public order. It is harassment. So we've got an amendment there. It was supported by, I think, 38 MPs from different parties, including 12 Tories at committee stage. I'm waiting for report stage, but as I say, report stage may never come, but we'll see what happens. If it does continue, I am confident that if we get the time to debate it, it will get voted in. If we don't get the time to debate it, then I've got plenty of people on standby in the Lords. So that's on buffer zones. The second one on decriminalisation, I think you're right. I think it is a bit like hitting a hornet's nest. And in all honesty, at the moment, I am nervous about reopening the law as a whole. And the reason I'm nervous about that is because I'm concerned that there are MPs who believe that women need to be decriminalised, who believe that doctors need to be decriminalised, but who are not alert to the issues of what they might then opt to give up in order to get that. So if they're trying to square a circle, as politicians are wont to do, reducing the time limit from 24 weeks or getting rid of Ground E, so serious or fatal fetal anomaly abortions post 24 weeks are the two big ones that I know that the anti-abortion people would go for. And my concern would be that in going for the decriminalisation of doctors, nurses and midwives, we would open up that area of the law in a way that isn't useful with a 72-seat Tory majority. So for me, I've kind of parked that area of decriminalisation, so fully repealing, turning it into a purely clinical procedure, until we might hopefully have a different government or a more balanced parliament. I was quite optimistic about that in the last one, but then obviously that all fell apart. So that's the sort of the bit on the doctors. When it comes to women and to pregnant people, I think that we're in a slightly different position. And the reason we're in a different position there is because of the people that are facing prosecution at the moment. So those two women, I think, provide something of a lightning rod for people that go, oh, well, it will never happen over here. And actually, you know what? In America, they don't criminalize women. Even in Texas, women are not criminalized for ending their own pregnancies. This is a peculiarly British and therefore Commonwealth interpretation of what abortion means and who is responsible for it. So it's, you know, it's worse than the worst places really in the world on abortion. I finished drafting some legislation today as a private member's bill that would do three things. It would disapply the existing law from women acting in relation to their own pregnancies. It would halt any prosecutions and criminal investigations into women, and it would introduce a kind of curing pardon, so that any woman who has got that on their record in relation to their own pregnancy would be pardoned. Now, the reason that needs to be sort of clarified is because the same law that is used to criminalize these women is also used to criminalize violent partners who kick a woman until she miscarries. That's the situation that we're in, that action is seen as akin to a woman buying pills off the internet and trying to end her own pregnancy out of desperation, or to a doctor providing care not quite in the right way. So that's kind of where we are. I am hopeful that we will be able to get somewhere on decriminalising women, because I think it is essential to the situation that we're in at the moment. And more than anything else, I just really want to be able to stop talking to this woman on the phone and essentially saying, I'm doing what I can, but I don't have anything for you right now. I'm sorry about your kids. I'm sorry about, you know, your life. I'm sorry about the fact that you've been under investigation for 2 years, but ultimately you're still going to be on trial for ending your own pregnancy. And yes, the press are probably going to find out about it. So I would really just like to be able to stop that.
Yeah, no doubt that is a really tough situation. Well, I want to thank you for all the work and the policy drafting that you have been doing to improve the situation in the UK. You're right about waiting until we don't have a massive Tory majority, I think, before touching the decriminalisation aspect. I think that's a very good point. So until that's over and they're gone, or, you know, there's less of them, we can come back to it. But once again, thank you very much for your work. And unless anyone else has any other questions. No, thank you very much for your talk and all the information. And at this point, I think let's split into discussion groups. There's about 15 of us, so I think 2 Zoom rooms, breakout rooms, which I'll set up in a second. Means the conversation will be easier to handle. If yourself and I, Rachel, go into one, and Lizzie and Sue, if you go into another, and then everybody else just splits whichever room you'd like to go into. I'm going to create them now. I'm going to stop recording for this particular part. So thank you very much again.